Hey everyone, tonight we're going to start with something a little darker. We're going to explore what life was actually like in the Middle Ages, a period marked by plagues, penalties, and pottage. You probably wouldn't last a day, so forget about the castles and chivalry that Hollywood promised you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you, and before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually love what I do here. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. Well done. The good news is that you're still alive, having just woken up in the year 1325. The fleas are also the bad news. Because it was a barn floor 3 months ago, your bed is a half-rotted straw mattress that is full of hay and bugs and has a barn floor odour. Memory foam, cushions and Egyptian cotton sheets are all missing, leaving just a wool blanket that hasn't been cleaned since the previous winter and is now about as heavy as a small cow due to the build-up of dirt. The distant sound of the church bell wakes you up. It's like an alarm clock from the Middle Ages, only louder and somehow less forgiving. Your family, domestic insects, and livestock all occupy the same space in your quaint open concept. One-room wooden cottage with no windows. Candles haven't been made yet, and even if they were, they would just melt on your dirt floor. The smell, is a fragrant symphony. A subtle blend of stale beer, human perspiration, goat, and something you pray isn't mould. You undoubtedly know your soul is scented. You quickly regret stretching because the air is chilly and your joints hurt. You're 22 years old, which is around middle age in medieval terms. Your knees sound like a bag of rocks being shaken by a bewildered peasant, and your spine creaks like an old wooden door. It's risky to get out of bed. Your naked feet are now a part of the ecology, whether the floor is crusty from something your neighbour's chicken did, or damp from last night's rain seeping through the thatched roof. And privacy too. What is it that your whole family's waking up next to you, along with perhaps a random cousin who has never left? Everything is common. There is no bedroom, no curtains, and no time for oneself. This is how your day begins. Welcome to medieval Europe, where you're never really alone because you're always accompanied by rats, parasites, and 8 other people. You've escaped your medieval haystack of horrors, but it only gets worse from here. Well done! Nature is calling now, and it's yelling rather than calling in a courteous manner. This is where you begin to miss the contemporary bathroom. No toilet, seat, toilet paper, flush, or even a somewhat bitter plunger in the corner are present. In the 14th century, getting rid of oneself is a social experiment, an adventure, and frequently a minor public gathering. A wooden bucket behind the house is probably your bathroom if you're a peasant, and it's already full because Uncle Wolfstan had a difficult night after eating rotten turnips. The odour is biblical. The worst part is that you throw it into the street after holding your breath and taking care of your business. Yes, before throwing it out the window you should yell something like "Gardez-lou" into the street. It means "watch out below" in Old French. But to be honest, nobody ever moves quickly enough. In medieval cities the streets are like open sewers, a picturesque river of animal feces, human waste and mysterious liquids you don't want to look at. You get to sit next to strangers in an outhouse, where ventilation is a cruel joke and privacy is a myth. If you're fortunate enough to live in a town with public restrooms, you may engage in short discussion but avoid taking heavy breaths. Toilet paper. I had never heard of it. Handshakes weren't common yet, which may be why most people wipe with straw, leaves, rags, moss, or a bit of wool if they're feeling very decadent. If you're in a castle, it must be nicer, right? In a way, you may have a guardrobe with a hole in the wall that allows waste to fall straight into the moat. Excellent plan, but your adversaries are aware of this, and sure, attackers have occasionally entered through the waste shield. Route mentions going through the rear entrance. Therefore, using the restroom in the Middle Ages is a humiliating custom for both farmers and barons. It's risky, it's cold, it's in the open, and it's always unpleasant. You already haven't washed your teeth, but we'll talk about that later. One slip on a whetstone path will land you first in humanity's scraps. You made it through the restroom. You should be rewarded, don't you? Perhaps a satisfying breakfast, something hot, tasty and cosy. Alas, this is Europe in the Middle Ages. There is nothing reassuring. Breakfast is a sombre occasion here, if you can call it that. There aren't any avocado toast, coffee makers that sputter awake, or eggs Benedict. Near the fire, you crouch or sit down next to a wooden dish filled with what appears to have been scraped off a dirty boot. Welcome to your pottage ration for the day. Pottage is a thick, gooey stew cooked with whatever grains, root vegetables, and, if you're lucky, a few beans you can find. New ingredients are simply added on top of the ones that have been cooking in the same pot for days or even weeks. It's more of a continuous gastronomic experiment than a recipe. A piece of bread so firm it could deflect arrows was on the side. Since wheat is a rich man's dream, it is produced from coarse rye or barley flour and frequently bulked out with sawdust, crushed up acorns, or other inventive materials. You're not going to like this loaf. You don't cut it, you bargain with it. How about beverages? You're not drinking an oat milk latte or orange juice. You're sipping beer. Beer at 6 a.m, yes, but why? Because the water is rife with dirt and parasites. With weak ale, little alcohol, and high survival, you begin your day. Children also consume it. It doesn't make anyone happy, but at least it won't make you crave cheese or meat right away. Only if your Lord is feeling giving will you dream on Sundays and saints' feast days. The majority of peasants only eat meat sometimes during the year, and they only consume fresh fruit when it's in season and hasn't already fermented into wine. Additionally, unless you are royalty, don't even consider spices. The price of a pinch of pepper exceeds your monthly salary. Salt has enough value to be kept in a safe place. Thus you gulp your medieval beer, chew your crusty bread, and try not to think about the rat that might have eaten your porridge during the dark. Breakfast just happens to you. It doesn't give you energy. It's time to work like your life relies on it, because it really does, now that you're suitably underfed. After consuming your depressing medieval meal, it's time to put on your clothes. It won't do any good. There is only one item in your closet, which is a linen shift or a rough wool tunic that you have worn every day for months or even years. The concept of seasonal fashion does not exist. Simply wear this till it breaks down or infects you with fungus. Optional underwear, a linen undertunic if you're lucky. Under layers of sweaty, itchy wool, meticulously stitched together by someone who most likely didn't know what a seam should look like, you're going commando if you're not feeling well. Additionally, your clothes are soiled, stiff and odorous like a compost pile that has been allowed to marinate in a pigsty because there isn't a washing machine, detergent or dry cleaner in sight. It's difficult to wash them, even if you wanted to. The process would involve gathering water from a well or river, heating it over a fire, cleaning your tunic on a board with lye or ashes, and then hanging it in the sun, which is out about 3 days a year. And let's not even talk about shoes, if you have any. They're poorly sewn, made of untreated leather, and provide about as much arch support as a banana peel. The majority of peasants just go barefoot across medieval landmines, which are characterised by jagged rocks and disease ponds, as well as through muck and excrement. All of this indicates that your skin despises you. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrive on your body, and you are itchy all the time. Nobility, miserable monks and itching kids strolling around insect farms are all common. Nobody gets away. No one will even notice if you use a wooden spoon to itch your armpit while conversing with the local priest. Unfortunately, there is no doctor, no hydrocortisone, and no one to tell you if you have a rash. Your skin is raw from rubbing your head, which is a battlefield of bites. Most likely it's scabies. You simply continue to suffer. Also, if you're fortunate, sufficient to prevent infection. Fantastic. For the next 6 months, the rash will just be with you like an unwanted medieval buddy. It's time to go outdoors and begin working yourself to death now that you're covered in discomfort and wearing a miserable outfit. It's time to show off your morning smile now that you're completely covered in itches and wet wool. But you don't, because with no toothbrush, toothpaste, mouthwash or floss, smiling was a risky game in the Middle Ages. Oral hygiene is as common as bathing, meaning that while some people may chew on a twig or clean their teeth with vinegar or wine, most people's teeth are on their own and not doing well. When you reach your mid-20s, your smile appears to have been lifted from a haunted crypt. There are several cavities, inflamed gums, and more than simply food stains on your teeth. Decomposition is that. You have more decay in your mouth than a root cellar from the Middle Ages. Although not yet widely available, sugar is increasingly used by the wealthy, who import it at high prices and use it primarily in little cakes or to flaunt their wealth. Congrats if you're a nobleman. Compared to the peasants, you get to ruin your teeth more quickly. If you're poor, you'll gradually get better through years of painful toothaches, spoiled bread, and gritty oatmeal. Adapt to them. They resemble the constant backdrop of medieval weather, the sort of agony that prompts you to think about drinking, praying, or using pliers to extract the teeth yourself. It's not a joke either. The real treatment was that. Barber surgeons were more common than dentists. Yes, the same person who trims your hair is also the one who extracts your molars by candlelight using an iron hook and an infected tooth that has no anaesthesia. I hope you enjoy having fevers since, in the absence of antibiotics, they can quickly develop into sepsis and create toothaches that could kill you. Yes, your funeral in the 1300s may have caused the same thing that takes us to a drugstore today, and there is no social respite either. I'm kissing. I wish you luck. There is halitosis and foul breath everywhere. You're not evaluated by your smile if you're single. Your livestock and your land are used to judge you. To put it briefly, your mouth is a battlefield, and losing the war is the result. Your true job, the one that will break your back, is just getting started, so let's go outdoors now that your teeth are aching. It's time to go to work, but there won't be an office, a desk, a coffee break, or a chance to advance. If you're like 90% of the people, your task is straightforward. Don't die while working for the comfort of others. You're a commoner. Well done. This implies that you labour on land that is owned by a lord who most likely forgets your name. The sun rises with you, and you only stop when it passes behind the trees. A rusty sickle, a wooden hoe, your tools, and whatever bones you still have. There is no clocking out and no weekend. Sunday's off, but only if you're not harvesting, fending off raiders, or fervently hoping that your infected toe won't turn black. Otherwise, it's only sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. It's a harsh job. Either oxen or hands are used to plough fields, digging ditches, planting seeds, pulling weeds and carrying water, until your spine starts to resemble the letter S is what you do, if you can afford one. It doesn't matter if you're exhausted. If you're a woman, and surprise, you don't only conduct field work, no one is asking how your mental health is doing. Besides taking care of the kids, you also cook, clean, spin wool, feed the animals, and act as though your husband's lice problem isn't slowly spreading to your side of the bed. Around age 5, children begin to assist. There is no school or playthings, only a small wooden rake, and the hope that they won't die of the flu someday. And if you're among the select few who don't work as a farmer, you might be a cooper, a tanner, or a blacksmith. You still spend your days in ill-ventilated sheds handling animal intestines or fire chemicals. The salary, essentially survival, the benefits, the breaking of bones, the occasional bleeding, the bad luck, the fever, the warm beer, and so on. Because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, medieval Europe has a remedy for that. You can't afford to stop even for a day. It's known as replacement. Thus, you hold onto your shovel, disregard the blisters, and continue. Since your back is burning from working in the fields, digging is a slow-motion endurance test rather than a career in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, temperature was more influenced by continuous punishment from the sky than by the seasons. Therefore, let's talk about the weather. First, let's talk about winter. You have windows covered with fabric rather than glass, wooden walls with holes you could toss a chicken through, and no insulation, central heating, or weatherproofing. Theoretically, the fire in the hearth is lovely, but you don't have enough firewood to keep it going because wood is costly, and sometimes illegal to get from the forest. Yes, if you pick up the wrong stick from the wrong forest, you could be put to death. You cling close to the dwindling embers, bundle up in your one damp wool tunic, and yet you wake up with your feet frequently damp and your nose chilled. Your tense fingers feel like little medieval popsicles. There is no diagnosis for frostbite. It's simply referred to as bad luck. Now let's fast forward to summer. It sounds better, doesn't it? Your house becomes a clay oven during the summer. No cross breeze, no fan, and no deodorant at all. You perspire through your layers, yet you are unable to take them off since it's scandalous and risky to expose too much skin. Social judgment and insect bites. Mosquitoes buzz by your ear as you sleep, assuming you can sleep through the sound of your neighbours shouting and infants wailing in the fields, and the sun bakes you. The flies are out in full force, drawn to your dirty body and the smell of last week's goat stew that is still fermenting in the corner. No hat, no sunscreen, unless you made one like a desperate scarecrow out of straw. You still have to work, which is the worst thing. Taking a bad turn is another name for heat stroke. You're either sweating through your lone pair of socks and your thighs are chafing into oblivion, or you're shivering in your own hovel and wondering if your toes will survive till spring. Additionally, no matter the season, your next job is still waiting, your food is still awful, and your clothing continue to itch. Greetings from climate control. There is no medieval style. Want to pour some water on your face, feel thirsty, and wake up from this damp fever dream of a life gone too bad? You don't want to be near water in the Middle Ages. It is silently attempting to kill you. Let's have a drink first. The neighbouring stream has the appearance of something from a dream film. Fresh, bubbling and clear. It's not upstream, but spoiler alert, a dead pig is most likely decaying in it. And if someone hasn't already thrown a chamber pot into it, bacteria, parasites, and the whole microbial army of medieval Europe are waiting in every drink. People drank beer for that reason. Yes, even kids drink alcohol. It was little beer, weak in alcohol, strong in survival, so don't envision medieval youths doing keg stands. In order to make the water safer than whatever ran through the town ditch, we boiled it. If you were wealthy and didn't care about getting your work done by noon, you could also buy wine. How about taking a bath? Water was undoubtedly utilised for cleaning. Theoretically, yes, but in reality, no. At the time, people thought that taking a bath actually opened your pores and allowed sickness to enter. Yes, bathing oneself was regarded as dangerous from a medical standpoint. There were common bathhouses, but they soon acquired a reputation as hotspots for gossip, scandal, and occasionally extreme medieval extracurricular activities. Apparently you were cleaner if you never removed the protective layer of filth that was layered on your skin. Naturally, the church became involved and closed several of them. It was a complete production, even if you wanted to take a bath. You would have to fill a wooden tub that was leaking, collect water from the well, boil it over a fire, and then hope that no one else in the house used it before you, or worse, after you. Additionally, rainwater is gathered in open barrels where moss grows, insects reproduce, and birds poop. Doesn't that sound refreshing? Hence, water in the Middle Ages is less of a life supply and more of a risk, whether it ends up in your mouth, on your body, or on your crops. If you take one bad gulp, you'll be sweating in a straw bed in your last days, gripping your stomach and thinking about all the things you could do with your life. Raise a glass for our ancestors every time you drink tap water. The luxury of hydration without risk was not available to them. You may or may not have sipped the water. Perhaps you just bumped into a disappointment-shaped rock. In any case, you're ill and require assistance. A doctor is necessary for you. Unfortunately, you live in the Middle Ages when a medical degree is essentially just polite torture. First, let's discuss the diagnosis. Your humours are out of balance, which is the root of everything that is wrong with you, including a cough, rash, shattered bone, and the creeping disease. According to medieval science, your health depends on maintaining the equilibrium of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, like an internal soup. Had too much blood and a fever. The answer is bloodletting. Yes, let's use a ravenous leech or a dull blade to empty your life essence into a bowl. Yes, barbers were frequently the ones who did it. It is obvious that there is too much black bile when a baby feels depressed or anxious, and has both a haircut and a hemoglobin extraction in the same session. Laxatives, perhaps a warm herbal purge, or simply prayers and a cold compress as everyone avoids eye contact and begins carving your coffin are all possible cures. Now you're in serious trouble if you shatter a bone or have a terrible cut. Unless you consider fainting from agony, there is no anaesthetic. Knives used for surgery haven't been cleaned since the time of the Crusades. The purpose of heating tools over fire is not to sterilise them, but rather to make them appear more frightening. Centuries ago, the germ theory did not yet produce antibiotics. They believed that illness is caused by contaminated air or by God being irritated by your immoral behaviour. It must have been your wicked thoughts that caused you to get a stomachache. I hope you like admitting while throwing up. More leeches, perhaps some crushed beetles, and a priest performing final rites at your bedside are all part of the treatment if your health worsens. At this point, they're getting ready for the cure, which is death. And if you miraculously get better, everyone just thinks God is sorry for you. The leech gets promoted while the doctor gets all the credit. Therefore, sure, medicine in the Middle Ages was more about surviving the cure than it was about healing. It's time to eat after a long day of work, lice and leeches. With a gnawing stomach, you shuffle back to your hovel, ready for a warm meal. the only thing that brings you joy left in life. The bad news is that your food is most likely attempting to murder you. Let's start with the fundamentals. There is no such thing as food preservation. There is only salt smoke or the hope that the winter air would keep things fresh. There is no refrigerator or freezer. If you're fortunate enough to have any meat, it has likely been marinated in dubious brine, covered in flies, and possibly shared with a few rats for days. The mainstay of the medieval diet is bread. Desperate peasants use bark, sawdust, or even mud to make it stretch, but even that is unsafe during years with poor harvests. Ergot, a fungus that causes convulsions, hallucinations, and occasionally death, is an added bonus if it's rye season. It's similar to consuming bread tainted with tetanus and LSD. Only use vegetables while they're in season. Turnips, are constantly in season. As you recall from Chapter 3, pottage is essentially a heated swamp of unknown things that has been simmering since your great-grandfather's funeral. There are a lot of turnips that are either boiled, crushed, or floating in it. Although there may be fruit in the fall, it rots rapidly, and sugar is scarce, costly, and hoarded by the wealthy to flaunt their grizzled teeth. Dairy is an additional risk. Hours pass before fresh milk becomes bad. Cheese and butter do better, although they are bacterially dense. Since it's either that or chewing your boot leather, people eat them nevertheless. Let's also discuss seasoning. For the average peasant, spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg are more valuable than gold. Onions and salt, if you're lucky, add flavour, and most meals taste like damp burlap tinged with sorrow. However, food poses a political as well as a health risk. If you are caught poaching a rabbit, you risk being punished, sent in jail, or possibly put to death. Game animals belong to the Lord. Yes, you may be hanged for your dinner. Because food didn't know in the Middle Ages, you consume your grey stew, despite the fact that every bite is dangerous when you sit down to eat it by flickering firelight. It puts you to the test, Irish. After working, suffering, and barely digesting your dubious meal, it is now nightfall. You may believe that the day is coming to an end, but keep in mind that God is keeping an eye on you. In medieval Europe, religion isn't just a part of life, it is life. The priest and your neighbour Agnes will definitely tell on you if you skip Mass. Your calendar, your laws, your education, whether you can read, your birth, marriage, death, and everything in between are all under church authority. It's like your spiritual landlord, and every day is planned around prayer bells, and you're always overdue on your payment. The town church bell chimes in the morning, noon, and night, because it is sinful to skip prayer, not because people need a reminder. Don't remember to bow. Eat meat on Fridays, sin. Sin in that one dream. Consider your neighbour's wife. A double sin. Indeed, hell is a very real place. Priests paint a wonderful picture of it, including rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, pitchfork-wielding devils, and never-ending screaming. If you're not afraid of the disease, you will be afraid of eternal damnation. You must rely on the church to translate everything for you, because the Bible is written in Latin, a language only monks, clergy, and that one aristocratic kid who is too good for dirt can understand. Therefore it's time to kneel more if the priest says that your crop failure is due to your lack of prayer. It is required that you tithe tenths of whatever you own. You donate wheat if you grow it. You offer eggs if you rear hens. Congratulations if you don't have anything. You're doomed financially and spiritually. There are dozens of holy days, holidays, and although they provide respites from work, they are not for enjoyment. Therefore it is risky to attend Mass. Fast, confess your sins, and remember that joy is a dangerous indulgence. It is also risky to criticise the church. Blasphemers are flogged, witches are drowned, heretics are burned, and doubters are swiftly converted. Therefore you perform the rituals, chanting, bowing, and praying, in the hopes that, if the priest approves of you, your soul will eventually arrive in paradise after living this life covered in dirt. Because while God may have been forgiving during the Middle Ages, the church was not. Try being a woman peasant in the Middle Ages if you thought it was difficult. During the Middle Ages, a girl's life path is essentially set in stone. With all the dirt, starvation and terror, as well as childbearing, subservience and social invisibility, being a woman is like being on hard mode without any health remedies or restart buttons from birth. Unless you come from a noble family and are sent to a convent, you are unlikely to receive an education, marry young, have children, serve your husband, and die exhausted. Around the time you learn how to repair a tunic and churn butter, your cerebral growth ceases, Marriage occurs at a very young age. Being engaged at the age of 12 and expecting a child at the age of 14 is not strange. It has to do with alliances, land and animals, not love. Once married, you are essentially your husband's property, and your opinion is not needed. Producing heirs, providing for everyone, and maintaining the household are your responsibilities. If you complain, you risk being labelled a naysayer or, worse, a witch. Childbirth is a death lottery, and that title includes a free drowning or burning, depending on local customs. There is no anaesthesia, no sterile equipment, and no prenatal care. Even slight issues can result in death for the mother, the infant, or both, despite midwives' best efforts. Some women make it through 10 pregnancies. Many don't make it through 2. Don't worry though, your workload will grow after the kid is born. You're supposed to cook, clean, nurse, and assist in the fields, while you're crying babies in a hut full with lice. There is no respite for you. For everyone else, you are the break. Unmarried people are suspicious, widowed people are weak, and outspoken people are dangerous. Women who didn't fit in were sometimes suspected of witchcraft, particularly if they knew a lot about herbs, had a strong personality, or simply found someone amusing on a dreary Tuesday. There are limits to your role, even in the church. Nuns had very stringent rules. You couldn't speak without permission, you couldn't walk about freely, and your spiritual value was always lower than men's. In summary, a woman in the Middle Ages is supposed to endure, submit, procreate, and endure in silence, preferably with a smile on her face, because it was somehow expected of women to suffer gracefully, even during a period of global pain. You have already fought against social injustice, squalor, poverty, and maybe a goat. But just when you think your day can't get much worse, bloody, loud, and frequently quite acceptable by medieval standards, violence breaks out. The Middle Ages were hardly a tranquil time, let's face it. The main purpose behind law and order was to make sure the local ruler wasn't feeling grumpy. There is violence everywhere, on the streets, in homes, on the battlefield, in church conflicts, and occasionally while waiting in line at the communal bread oven. There is a lot of crime. Justice is more performance art than protection, and punishment is harsh. Take a bread loaf. If you're accused of lying, you could have your tongue pierced and lose a hand. Too much gossip. Get to know the reprimands. For correction, place a bar in your mouth and wear a metal mask fastened to your head. Naturally. Imagine being charged with a terrible crime, such as stealing, witchcraft, or heresy. How can one demonstrate their innocence? Through torture. Welcome to trial by ordeal, of course. In one variant, you retrieve a stone by sticking your hand into boiling water. You're innocent if it cures in 3 days without infection. If not, you are at fault. You could also be thrown into a river. You're innocent and most likely die if you sink. You're guilty and will still face consequences if you float. It resembles a medieval game show with a survival prize, a host who actively opposes you, and a public execution if you receive a death sentence. Hangings, beheadings, burnings, and executions are all carried out in front of applauding spectators. Occasionally delicacies are brought. It's cable TV's medieval counterpart. Domestic violence is a very common occurrence. It was acceptable, even expected, for husbands to reprimand their wives and kids. Street fights are widespread. War is always simmering, local feuds, territorial disputes, religious crusades, and someone is always going off to stab someone else in the name of honour, God, or boredom. You could be beaten simply for glancing the wrong way at a noble's horse. Medieval society did not collapse into violence. Society is the issue. Everybody is always aware that justice is capricious, life is brittle, and your neighbour could beat you up over a pig. Thus, proceed with caution, keep your head down, and never put your trust in anyone brandishing a club. You've survived the lice, leeches, washing, reduced suffering, and the imminent danger of being publicly disemboweled by now. The last chapter of most medieval lives is about to begin, an early and unglamorous death. You're essentially a celebrity if you're above 40 and still alive and well. You may even be called the Old One, which is more of a statistical marvel than a nickname. Let's dissect it. Infant mortality significantly lowers the average life expectancy, which is approximately 3,040 years. Almost half of all children passed away before turning 5. It only needed one terrible winter, disease, or starvation. Without vaccinations, antibiotics, or hope, if you made it through childhood, You were already worn out when you hit adulthood. As soon as you were able to stand up, you started working, and by the time you were 25, your joints were creaking like a monastery door. You may have lost a finger, a few teeth, and the most of your initial optimism. Women had to endure a particularly lethal gauntlet delivery. For medieval women, it was one of the main causes of death. All you needed was prayer, hot water, and someone to hold your hand while you bled out on a straw-stuffed cot. No painkillers or medical assistance. The risks were different for men, but they were just as constant. Farming, mishaps, minor wound infections, a neighbour's inebriated fury, and a sidetracked crusade. Even going to the market on foot could be dangerous if you run into an irate tax collector or a bored bandit. The plague, which turned cities into cemeteries overnight. Famine, which could last for entire seasons and eat out entire villages. Or bad luck, such as eating spoiled grain and spending your last hours screaming and hallucinating at the walls and funerals. You were lucky if you got one. Can also cause death in a quiet way. In order to prevent disease, bodies were frequently buried promptly. There was no polished coffin or embalming, only a hole, a few whispered prayers, and, if there was still room in the churchyard, a shallow pile of dirt. Indeed, life in the Middle Ages was harsh, brief, and under continual threat from death in all of its manifestations. You never retired. Let's go on to your last chapter, where the medieval dream fades, as you recently quit showing up and talking about exits. How has your day gone then? You've woken up in filth, brushed your teeth with wishful thinking, almost died of starvation, pushed yourself to the bone, prayed to avoid contracting the plague, scratched your way through scratchy wool, brushed your teeth with wishful thinking, and narrowly avoided being publicly executed for owning a squirrel. Greetings from a day in medieval Europe when you still aspire to be a knight. Rethink the idealized portrayal of the Middle Ages, complete with valiant warriors, aristocratic women in towers, valiant conflicts, and banquets in magnificent candlelight rooms. It is a myth that has been refined by fantasy literature and fairy tales. The medieval world was, in reality, harsh, unjust, and grim. It was all about hierarchy. You remained impoverished if you were born that way. You had a higher chance of surviving if you were born wealthy, but you were still one nasty soup away from being sick and being buried too soon. Not even the nobles were exempt from suffering. Sure, you had a fur cloak and a mug of wine, but you also had a 50% chance of dying in a battle or from an infected splinter. Castles were drafty stone refrigerators full of fleas, smoke, and politically motivated marriages. Even the easier days weren't easy. They didn't let up. It all took longer. Everything was more painful. There were repercussions for everything from chewing to birthing. There wasn't much you could do with the time you did have to contemplate, fantasize, or envision a better life, because life was about survival, not pleasure. No modern medicine, no upward mobility, and no Google Internet. You lived, suffered, worked, and passed away within 10 miles of your birthplace. What's this strange rash? The wildest portion, though, comes next. Despite all of this, people continued to laugh, sing, tell stories, fall in love, and find meaning. Not because life was simple, but rather because people are intransigent. They created room for light, even in the darkest chapters. So perhaps offer a silent thank you to the contemporary world when you get into your clean bed tonight, complete with central heating, indoor plumbing, and antibiotics. Her forefathers struggled against feudalism, starvation, and rats. Therefore, it wouldn't be long before she became Catherine, the magnificent empress of all of Russia, the reformist mistress and the symbol of ambition. She was just Sophie. The daughter of a relatively unknown German princely family, Sophie Friederike was born Auguste von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729. Her small duchy in Pomerania offered little in the way of power, but Sophie herself possessed a sharp mind, unrelenting charm, and a silent, insatiable desire for greatness that no title could ever match. She had a harsh upbringing. Johanna, her mother, was a social climber who was fixated on position rather than a loving, caring person. She was cold and cunning. From an early age, Sophie learnt to balance obedience and slyness because her father, a Prussian officer, was more aloof than strict. As the Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna started looking for a wife for her heir, Grand Duke Peter, She developed a variety of survival skills, including knowing several languages, reading a lot, and observing a room before speaking in it. She looked beyond the boundaries of Russia. Since Peter was of German ancestry, Empress Elizabeth thought a foreign spouse who was appreciative and docile would be simpler to manage. Sophie was the ideal candidate since she had a reputation for grace and humility, noble lineage, and a Lutheran faith that she would have to give up. Sophie was called to Russia when she was just 14 years old. With a polite grin and thin German textiles, she came in the frigid city of St. Petersburg in 1744. Like a chess piece, her mother shoved her forward. But Sophie was playing a game of her own to fit in with Russian society. She changed her name to Ekaterina Alexeyevna Catherine after converting to Orthodoxy. The public, significant and life-changing ceremony took place. She was not only converting to a new religion, she was entering a foreign empire with no way out, burning the bridge behind her. Betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, and empire were all events that no one observing that reserved adolescent girl in a fur-trimmed coat could have foreseen. Sophie, however, ceased being a pawn as soon as she entered the Russian court and started making plans to become a queen. The goal of Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was to guarantee her position as a member of Russian aristocracy. However, it felt more like a prison than a crown right from the start. Instead of being the handsome prince of fairy tales, Peter, the heir to the Russian throne, was clumsy, immature, and preoccupied with toy soldiers. He was much more interested in playing war games in his chambers than in running an empire or demonstrating love to his new bride. According to other reports, he even declined to consummate the marriage. He hated the Russian court that had taken him in, and spent years admiring Frederick, the King of Prussia. Catherine, on the other hand, welcomed Russia with a fiery resolve. She studied its history, picked up the language, and committed traditional practices to memory. She desired to fit in. Peter wanted to get away from this mismatch since it was not only emotional, but also political. The Russian court was a breeding ground for vicious power struggles, paranoia, and gossip. Despite her deteriorating health, Empress Elizabeth continued to govern with unlimited power. Everyone had a plan, and was aware that a change was imminent. They were always watching Catherine. Every action she took was closely examined, her friendships were tracked, and her correspondence were read. In this society, alliances might quickly turn into charges, so she couldn't trust her husband, her mother, who was still whispering in her ear on behalf of foreign interests, or even her maids. Catherine, however, was not a fool. In contrast to her husband's childish outbursts and open disdain for Russian customs, Catherine learned to play the court's games in secret, built allies in the shadows, charmed military officers, befriended academics, and established a reputation for dignity and restraint. She also started reading Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu, while others viewed her as a young consort. She was creating a vision for Russia as a strong, intelligent, and rational country, not just for herself. One issue, though, was that Catherine survived longer the longer Peter did, remained in a state of uncertainty, a helpless spouse to an unworthy ruler. So she watched, waited, and made plans. She was aware that no one would inherit the Russian throne. After almost 20 years of waiting, observing, and stealthily navigating, Catherine finally recognized her opportunity and took it with amazing accuracy in 1762. After the death of Empress Elizabeth, Peter III became Tsar, but his rule quickly came to an end. Peter praised Prussia, Russia's historical adversary, lavishly, insulted the army, angered the nobility, and alienated the church in a matter of months. He publicly discussed divorcing Catherine in order to wed his mistress, reverted important legislation, and degraded the clergy. Already suspicious of his capricious conduct, the court became icy. Generals loyal to Catherine complained in the hallways of the army. Peter was viewed as a foreign puppet who made fun of their customs by even the most loyal and pious Russians. As all of this was going on, Catherine took action in July of that year. With the help of her boyfriend Grigory Orlov and his powerful brothers, as well as other important military officers, she carried out a bloodless coup d'etat while Peter was away at his summer palace. She gained the loyalty of the strong imperial guard, was crowned Empress Catherine II, and rode through St. Petersburg in full splendour. Unprepared and without allies, Peter gave up. He was arrested in a matter of days, and then discovered dead under suspicious circumstances. It was officially described as a hemorrhoidal colic. It was, informally, murder. Not by birth or marriage, but by will, intelligence and audacity, Catherine became empress. This was unique. A foreign-born lady with no rightful claim had seized the Russian crown without a single conflict. But that was only the beginning of her true challenge. She needed to turn her audacious attempt at power into a legacy that would last. Would she be accepted in Russia? Would she be respected by the nobles? Would she be able to maintain the empire without meeting the same end as her husband? Catherine needed to reign as a visionary rather than a schemer, because she knew that power acquired via intrigue might be lost just as easily. This was the beginning of her transition from a cautious plotter to a reforming empress who would redefine what it meant to be a woman in authority, redraw borders, and embrace enlightenment. Catherine might have relied on her position of authority once she was crowned, but she chose not to. Beyond merely holding a position of power, she aspired to change Russia, not just politically or militarily, but also intellectually. Catherine did not merely read Enlightenment philosophy. She also believed in reason, education, and the role of a monarch as a servant of the people, even if she herself ruled with absolute authority. Peter had worshipped Frederick, the great and toy soldiers, while Catherine had idolised Voltaire, Diderot, and the daring thinkers of the Enlightenment. She experienced it firsthand. She welcomed Diderot to her court, bought his whole library to help him financially, and wrote to Voltaire directly for more than 15 years, complimenting him while defending her authoritarianism. She studied legal documents, discussed reforms, and created plans to modernise the empire behind closed doors. She worked to codify Russian legislation throughout her early reign. In 1767, she established a legislative commission with the lofty goal of revising Russia's entire legal system. In disguise, Catherine's personal instruction or nekaz was a political manifesto that discussed issues like equality before the law, the perils of torture, and the duty of rulers to uphold the common good. It was radical for an empress in 18th century Russia, but Enlightenment principles had to endure in the face of Russia's massive feudal, profoundly conservative society, which was dominated by aristocrats who preferred their serfs to be under them. Catherine was aware of this. She proceeded cautiously even as she promoted reform. She constructed schools and libraries, outlawed some types of torture, and increased access to secular education. But she also upheld the nobility's authority over their serfs in order to maintain their allegiance. Part of her balancing act as a philosopher queen was this. In private, Blick was a pragmatic empress who balanced idealism and survival between the glittering salons of Paris and the grim politics of Moscow. Although her vision for Russia was ambitious, it was always well thought out. Making Russia European was not Catherine's goal. Yes, she was attempting to modernise Russia according to her own standards, which included reform, but Catherine wasn't satisfied with internal change. Peter the Great had opened a portal to the west, and she wished to extend it outward, to make it an empire to be feared, admired, and envied. Russia's frontiers were more expansive than ever under Catherine's rule, and she set out to tear down the walls. She fought wars to alter the European geography, in addition of defending her throne. The Ottoman Empire was the target of one of her most important campaigns. These wars, which broke out in waves between the 1760s and 1770s, were about more than just land. They have to do with influence. Catherine believed she was the legitimate defender of Eastern Europe and the rescuer of Orthodox Christians under Muslim domination. Russia seized important areas under generals like Grigory Potemkin and Alexander Suvorov, including Crimea, the Black Sea's northern shore, and warm water ports, things that Russian czars had long desired. These were not merely military triumphs. They served as a metaphor. Catherine made it clear that Russia was no longer Europe's distant, backward cousin with each conquest. The force was continental. In a series of agreements and diplomatic ploys, Catherine also looked westward. She helped divide Poland, dividing the beleaguered Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with Austria and Prussia. By 1795, when the Third Division came to a conclusion, Russia had claimed millions of new subjects and enormous new areas, erasing Poland from the map. Catherine, however, did not merely use soldiers to conquer. She colonized with thoughts as well. German settlers were enticed to develop Russian lands, trade routes were extended, and new cities were constructed. From the frigid Baltic to the sun-drenched Black Sea coasts, the empire turned into a mosaic, and Catherine stayed at its core, reviewing reports, giving commands, and personally directing the development of her growing empire. She would be criticised for being imperialist and power-hungry. However, Catherine did not view expansion as ambition. It was fate. She felt that a great ruler was judged by borders as much as by ideals. She had more in mind than simply ruling Russia. For all her genius and power, Catherine the Great was as legendary for what transpired behind the palace doors. No, not all of it was whispered in libraries, and she wished to recast it as a civilized empire that was feared by its adversaries, revered by its peers, and devoted to her alone. One of the most talked about elements of Catherine's rule was her private life. She had a carefully selected parade of lovers, many of whom were decades younger, attractive, and occasionally powerful in politics. They weren't hidden by her. Among the most significant of these lovers was Grigory Potemkin, a man as clever as he was audacious. She frequently rewarded them with titles, estates, and pensions if they behaved well. If not, they were quietly dismissed, occasionally with a promotion and a kind thank you. The distinction between passion, politics, and cooperation became hazy in their relationship. According to some historians, they may have even secretly wed. Together they influenced colonial efforts, military campaigns, and the development of southern Russia. Potemkin was more than a romantic partner. In many respects, he was her co-ruler. Europe, however, was unable to ignore the issue. She was portrayed in satirical pamphlets and gossip as lusty, ravenous, and even insane. The stories only grew worse after her passing, with her opponents spreading a bizarre and wholly untrue story about a horse to defame her reputation. However, the reason for the obsession is straightforward. In a society where female leaders were supposed to be either tragic characters or pious virgins, Catherine was a lady who exercised authority without apology. She was dangerous because she lived, loved, and controlled according to her own rules. Paradoxically, Catherine was profoundly philosophical about love and sexuality, despite the fact that her detractors portrayed her as immoral. She thought that private connections didn't have to jeopardize public duties, and that pleasure was a normal part of life. Few male monarchs were able to detach emotion from governing like she did. Her relationships were actually frequently purposeful. She surrounded herself with dependable, competent, and politically helpful men, and when they stopped being such, she let them go, typically grinning and giving them a nice retirement. Catherine's romantic life did not make her authority any less strong. She was admired and feared for all of her charisma and control because of her plan, which combined passion and power. There were dangers during Catherine's rule, and in 1773 a bearded Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev presented that danger. He wasn't your typical rebel. Pugachev asserted that he was Peter, the deceased spouse of the third Catherine. He claimed that he had returned to retake the kingdom from the German usurper after surviving the coup. It was ridiculous. The assertion didn't have to be accurate to the tired and oppressed lower classes of Russia, but Peter was long dead. All it had to do was give hope. Pugachev pledged the common people land, reduced taxes, freedom, and an end to serfdom. His promises sounded like redemption, and they ignited a fire throughout the Volga River region, particularly among Cossacks, peasants, and old believers, at a period when the divide between aristocrats and serfs had widened viciously. The biggest peasant revolt in Russian history was the Pugachev Rebellion. For a horrifying moment, it appeared as though the empire itself could break apart as towns were captured, fortresses collapsed, and aristocrats were massacred. Catherine trembled. She couldn't use cavalry and treaties to win this foreign war. This was an uprising against the system she ruled from within her own people. Catherine, however, remained calm. She took action. She sent in professional troops to brutally put an end to the uprising. After the defeat of Pugachev's forces in 1774, when he was taken prisoner, put on display in an iron cage, and then beheaded in Moscow as a public warning to anyone who dared to follow, Catherine redoubled her efforts to maintain order and control. Her hopes of quietly freeing the serfs vanished into silence after the rebellion showed her the limits of enlightenment in a nation still bound by feudalism. She now placed more reliance on the nobility, who promised loyalty in return for complete control over their serfs. This marked a sea change. Once quoting Voltaire, The Empress now put stability ahead of philosophy. Reform grew more circumspect, surveillance grew, and revolt even threatened to be put down before it could breathe. Despite his death, Pugachev left behind a warning that plagued Catherine. Power based on inequality could only last so long before the storm broke out. Catherine the Great had ruled Russia for more than 30 years longer than any other woman in Russian history by the time she was nearing the end of her life. Under Catherine's rule, Russia became a real European powerhouse after she defied expectations, reorganized her kingdom, and redefined what a woman and a queen could be. Crimea, portions of Poland, and portions of the Black Sea coast were all absorbed into its more than 200,000 square mile territory expansion. These wins were not merely military, they were crucial turning points that changed trade and secured warm water ports. But maps weren't the sole representation of her legacy. Catherine also made a cultural impact. She was a founding member of the Hermitage Museum, communicated with the brightest minds of the Enlightenment, and accumulated one of Europe's largest art collections. Catherine established Russia firmly on the cultural map by transforming her court into a hub of elegance, art, and intellectual aspiration in a nation that Western Europeans frequently perceive as backward. She encouraged the publishing of books and established schools for girls, modernizing education. In a display of scientific courage for her era, she publicly received the vaccination and brought the smallpox injection to Russia. However, her reign was also marked by inconsistencies. She never released the serfs, despite her admiration for Enlightenment principles. She actually spread serfdom farther beyond Russia's borders. Although remarkable, her changes were primarily top-down, and aimed at enhancing the empire rather than radically altering its core. Nevertheless, stability and ambition were brought about by Catherine's reign. She realised that one did not inherit power. It was planned, coordinated, and continuously protected. She reigned by willpower, political savvy, and unrelenting calculation rather than by divine right. She was referred to as a seductress, a reformer, a tyrant, and a usurper. But most importantly, she was successful. She left behind a throne safe, an expanding empire, and a mythology that would last for decades. When she passed away in 1796, Russia was richer, bigger, and more powerful than it had been in previous centuries. Catherine did more than simply rule. She became more than just an empress by ruling with intelligence, cunning, and an unreserved hold on history. Despite her rise to prominence and lasting influence, Catherine the Great remained fundamentally a woman navigating a male-dominated world and moulding it to fit her own vision. The person behind the state decrees and the imperial portraits was acutely aware of how vulnerable her position was. She wasn't Russian by birth. A coup brought her to the throne. Despite ruling an empire that didn't want a woman in leadership, she not only survived but flourished. Being decorative was never enough for Catherine. She never stopped studying, never stopped writing, and never stopped reading. Hours of reading reports, communicating with foreign powers, amending official documents, and overseeing a court full of conflicting factions made up her demanding daily agenda. Sitting on the throne was not enough for her. Like a born stateswoman, she worked the throne. In many respects, she was also lonely. Her greatest emotional partnership with Grigory Potemkin faded into a deep friendship, but his death in 1791 left a wound that never fully healed. She surrounded herself with courtiers, lovers, and artists, but she wrote in her memoirs that she could not trust many people. Her son Paul, whom she distrusted and kept out of state affairs, grew into a man she feared would undo all her progress. Catherine meticulously constructed her image. She was more adept at using narrative than other rulers of her era, and she recognized its power. She pretended to be the warrior empress, the mother of Russia, an educated ruler, and an art enthusiast. Beneath those roles, however, was a woman who had persevered through scandal, betrayal, rejection, and rebellion. She left behind a changed empire when she passed away in 1796, but there are still debates about whether she could have done more to put an end to serfdom. Did politics damage her Enlightenment ideals? Was she a ruler or a reformer? She never called herself the Great, but history remembers her as such. In a time and place when women weren't meant to have any authority, she took it and used it however she saw fit. It wasn't because she was perfect, nice, or simply wore the crown. The ruins of Palenque whisper stories from the old Maya culture, and towering temples rise above the canopy, their limestone faces weathered by time but still overflowing with mysteries. In the steamy depths of the Chiapas rainforest in southern Mexico, she reinvented what it meant to deserve one. And one of those secrets came to light in 1994. The Throne Temple was a relatively small pyramid next to the more well-known Temple of the Inscriptions, the tomb of the powerful King Pakal. A group of Mexican archaeologists led by Fanny Lopez Jimenez were surveying the temple when they noticed something strange. A sealed, hidden chamber beneath the structure. It had not been touched by looters. It was immaculate. The archaeologists discovered a stone sarcophagus lying quietly inside when they broke through and descended. The weight of centuries weighed heavily on the air. Red dust rose, vivid, stunning red like smoke as they opened the lid. Powdered cinnabar, a poisonous mercury sulfide that the Maya utilized ceremonially, blanketed the interior. And the skeleton of a woman lay inside that red cloud. She had been respectfully and carefully buried. Her body was encircled by burial offerings, necklaces, diadems, and ear spools made of jade and shell, and her bones were delicate but undamaged. Her head was still wearing a jade mask. The burial exuded royalty in every way, but she was not designated by any glyphs or name. It was a complete mystery, despite being one of the wealthiest female tombs ever discovered in Mesoamerica. Why was red powder used to bury her? Who was she? Was she a priestess, a queen, or maybe the wife of Pakal? She was dubbed the Red Queen by the researchers, and the moniker stuck. But they couldn't, not even with contemporary forensics. Only knowing she had lived during the Golden Age of Palenque in the 7th century gave us a firm idea of who she was. Her grave had been concealed, unaltered, and deliberately segregated in contrast to the majority of Maya tombs. Her funeral was more than a formality. It had a spiritual quality. It was intended that this woman would be remembered via ritual, colour, and the mystery she left behind, not through words. The red dust which covered the sarcophagus, the walls, her bones, and even the offerings surrounding her, clung to the Maya like blood to stone. This was the most eerie aspect of the Red Queen's tomb, not her jade jewels or the quiet of the sealed chamber. This was no coincidence. In ancient times, one of the most revered and hazardous chemicals was cinnabar, which was manufactured from crushed mercury sulfide. Its vivid red hue was more than just eye-catching. It represented the renewal of blood, and the life energy that united the divine and human worlds. Red was revered. It represented daybreak, sacrifice, and the rebirth of a life after death. It wasn't merely symbolic either. It had a spiritual quality. It was customary to cover the deceased with cinnabar in order to change their body and preserve it for transition rather than eternity. Death, according to Maya thought, was a transition onto a different cosmic layer rather than the end. Thus, the Red Queen, whatever she was being readied for deification as well as burial. There's more to this, though. Cinnabar is poisonous. Mercury poisoning, tremors, hallucinations, and even death can result from repeated exposure. The Maya sensed its power even though they probably didn't comprehend the chemistry. Bathing a corpse in it was risky, volatile, and a sign that the person was not your typical mortal in Palenque. Cinnabar was buried with very few. The site is dominated by the Pyramid of Pakal, the great and powerful monarch. The fact that his body was covered in the crimson powder that sparked conjecture alone was similar to hers. Her skull had been positioned on a layer of jaguar skin, suggesting that she was the Red Queen, his wife, his mother, or someone of comparable divine significance. The needles, obsidian knives, and tiny jade figurines surrounding her bone suggested ceremonies carried out in her honour or during her lifetime. There was a world of silence around the Red Queen's crimson-stained remains, broken only by the gleam of jade shell and obsidian. Every aspect of her funeral told a story without words, a story of power shrouded in secrecy, a woman ready to enter the underworld, not in silence, but in ceremony drenched in the colour of sacrifice. These weren't just decorations. Each one was a thoughtfully selected offering to travel with her to the Maya afterlife. At her sides were Xibalba necklaces made of jade, which was not only beautiful but also sacred. The necklaces were chilly and heavy, and their polished surfaces were still glowing after being buried for 300 years. It was seen by the Maya as a representation of perpetual life. Since only the elite were buried with jade, it symbolized the green of maize, the vigor of the jungle, and the breath of the gods. For the Red Queen, it covered her ears, wrists, and chest, making it obvious that she had influence, possibly even divine favor, during her lifetime. The jade funerary mask that was elegantly draped over her face was among the most eerie items. Scattered close to her bones were bone needles, obsidian blades, and shell artifacts. This mask, which was made from dozens of tiny mosaic tiles arranged to mimic the contours of her skull, was subtle in contrast to the golden death masks of Egypt. Its ritual purpose was to protect the soul, preserve identity, and present her as divine in the eyes of the gods. These might have been ceremonial implements or representations of her position as a royal matriarch, priestess, or healer. A faint but intentional echo of her voice, lost to time, was etched on one bone pin. The Maya believed that the afterlife was a journey, and the ceramic jars at her feet and along the tomb's edges were still sealed. These vessels were probably originally filled with offerings of food, drink, or incense to keep her spirit alive after death. Risky, complex, and full of obstacles, these weren't luxury goods. They were essential for modernization. The tomb has a deliberate personal feel without becoming overly crowded. There were only objects selected with spiritual significance. No gold, chariots, or grandeur. It served as a soul map. We can see from these artifacts how the Maya viewed death as a change of power rather than as finality. The Red Queen was not laid to rest in obscurity. In spite of the splendor of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind a disturbing emptiness. No name, no inscriptions on her sarcophagus, and no symbols on the walls that would have identified her. Scholars started attempting to make connections as soon as her tomb was unearthed, despite the fact that she was obviously a strong person. The Red Queen was, according to the most convincing theory, Zakbu Ajar, the wife of Kinnick Jana Pakal, the most well-known Palanque monarch to this day. Zakbusha wasn't merely Pakal's partner. She was married young into the Palanque royal lineage after being born into a noble family. During her husband's rule, she was an important ceremonial figure and had at least 3 sons, all of whom were highly esteemed. The fact that the tomb was situated only a few feet from Pakal's own opulent temple burial lends credence to the idea that she was the only person who could be buried with such dignity. The closeness of the inscriptions points to a purposeful matching of husband and wife rulers, even in death. And the cinnabar comes next. Pakal and the Red Queen were the only 2 tombs in Palang with such thick cinnabar covering. This is not likely to have been a coincidence, but the mystery grows from here. Both sets of remains underwent DNA testing in an attempt to corroborate the connection, but the results were inconclusive. Although there was no direct maternal connection between the woman's bones and Pakal, a spousal bond was still possible. After all, shared blood is not a prerequisite for marriage. According to some, she might have been Sakuk Pakal's strong mother, ruling Palanque before he reached adulthood. Others speculate that she might have been a sister, a high priestess, or a royal ancestor whose name has only been obscured by the passage of time. However, the most compelling evidence points to Zakbuka, a mother of kings, a queen by title, and Pakal's spiritual equivalent. It might not be a mistake that there is no name. It might have been deliberate. According to Maya cosmology, the soul persisted through ritual symbols and earthly whispers rather than monuments. As a result, the Red Queen, a lady who ruled remembered not in stone but in scarlet and silence, continued to hover between myth and reality. The Red Queen's culture, from whence she originated, was one in which Maya women, particularly royal ones, had greater power than most people believe. Politics in Maya society was frequently a family matter. Royal women were more than just submissive spouses. They were power brokers, priestesses, and ambassadors. They sponsored temples, performed rites, and were essential to preserving the legitimacy of the dynasty. They secured claims to the throne and formed alliances using their bloodlines as political capital. For instance, consider Pakal the Great's mother, Sekuk. She assumed power herself and governed as queen regent until her son reached adulthood, after the Palanque throne became vacant. She wasn't a stand-in. She was a sovereign in her own right, making laws and managing building projects. Without her, Pakal might never have risen at all. She was not unique in the Maya world. Inscriptions from sites like Yakulan Naranjo and Calakmul depict women conducting important rituals, fighting, negotiating, and occasionally ruling outright. In Stelian murals, they were frequently depicted standing next to, or occasionally above kings as equals while wearing ornate headdresses and regalia. They had engraved their words in glyphs. Until they weren't, their names were recalled. Much of the recollection had been lost by the time Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later. Native women were viewed as silent characters in a world dominated by men via the colonial lens. However, the archaeology presents a more nuanced picture. Gender roles in which authority was not inherited but rather contested. The Red Queen is viewed differently in this light. Although she may not have held a position of official authority, her holy burial and placement next to Pakal indicate that she was a key member of the royal family. Her jade mask was more than ornamentation. It served as a representation of identity, strength and protection in both life and death. The Maya civilization's Palancas dynasty may have been held together by her bloodline. A queen was more than just a queen. She was a voice in ceremonies, a guardian of sacred heritage, and frequently the link between the gods and humans. Despite having no name, the Red Queen had a voice in her kingdom. Treasures were not the only items buried with the Red Queen. Her tomb was more than just a cemetery. It was a work of purposeful building, loaded with ritual symbolism, Maya cosmology, and deliberate design. It served as an entrance to eternity. Her body was found within Temple 3rd, one of the lesser pyramids in the centre of Palenque, but the fact that it was next to Temple, and that it had inscriptions indicating that Pakal the Great was buried there, indicates that these temples weren't constructed at random. Their hallowed placement was determined by myth, astrology, and dynastic heritage. A locked crypt that has been perfectly maintained and unspoiled by looters is hidden within the temple, the Thirthad, which rises humbly in comparison to its majestic neighbour. It was built deep inside the temple, only reachable by a small steep staircase. It almost feels like a ritual trek down into the underworld, as she descends into her tomb. Perhaps that stillness is deliberate, but the chamber itself is bleak, composed of cut stone, and has been hermetically shut for more than 300 years. The walls are devoid of glyphs and murals, and no elaborate sculptures tell her narrative. This was a place where the dead may change, not for the living to understand. In the middle is her sarcophagus, which is a limestone altar. The Scarlet Queen's tomb is more muted than Pakal's opulent stone coffin next door, whose lid is renowned for being etched with cosmic rebirth scenes. Though there are subtle architectural clues that allude to meaning, the emphasis is inside, on the corpse, the cinnabar, and the death ceremony itself. The tomb's east-west alignment represents a symbolic passage that reflects the sun's transition from life to death. Despite its modest size, the chamber is strong. It feels purposeful, intimate, and like a hallowed space for a person of high regard. Maya temples served as cosmological instruments and conduits between the ground, the underworld, and the skies. To be laid to rest in one was to transcend the human plane. It wasn't an afterthought that the Red Queen would have an eternal residence. It was a meticulously built temple, a place where metamorphosis was the result of death. Her bones lie in stone, her spirit in cinnabar, and her legacy in the temple's architecture, which tells us that she was important to the ancient Maya, and that life continued after death. For a person like as the Red Queen, this crossing was not only spiritual but also political, cosmological, and heavily ritualized. It was a threshold, a sacred gateway into the underworld known as Xibalba. The purpose of the meticulously planned, myth-based burial rites was to help the soul navigate the perilous depths of the underworld. According to Maya writings and imagery, there was no tranquil afterlife in Xibalba. The Red Queen was buried wrapped in cinnabar, encased in stone, and surrounded by offerings, all indications of an elite burial, but there was more. It was a labyrinth of darkness, rivers of blood, trials, and gods of death, and only those who were properly buried, ritually prepared, and spiritually equipped could make the journey successfully. Obsidian blades and bone needles found in her tomb suggest auto-sacrifice practices. These may be symbolic implements of ceremonies she had carried out during her lifetime, or that were reenacted during her funeral to strengthen her soul. Carefully crafted from jade tiles, her funeral mask served more purposes than just decoration. According to Maya belief, it might have functioned as a spiritual vessel, protecting her identity and face while she travelled into the afterlife. The face was a reflection of the soul, and the gods had to be able to identify the soul. Other objects, such as stingray spines or shell trumpets, would have served as spiritual instruments, cries to the gods, or markers of ritual contact. The ceramic pots that surrounded her might have formerly contained cocoa, maize, water, or perhaps pulque to nourish her in the hereafter. Burial was a metamorphosis, not merely a farewell. According to Maya belief, death is a seed, burial is a planting, and rebirth occurs in the hereafter. It was common belief that kings and queens were God's earthly avatars who returned to their divine roots after they died. Covered in blood, buried in a pyramid, and honoured with gifts, the Red Queen was being prepared for rebirth, not as a mortal, but as a creature bound to the cosmic order. Her mythology began when she was buried, but her story didn't finish there. One of Mesoamerica's most famous graves, that of Kinnick Janab Pakal, also known as Pakal the Great, is located a short distance from the Red Queen's ultimate resting place. His burial within the magnificent Temple of the Inscriptions is renowned for its craftsmanship, size, and profoundly spiritual meaning. However, it is not just the contents of the Crimson Queen's tomb that make it so remarkable. That's where it was discovered. In a city like Palang, where each temple was thoughtfully placed to represent cosmic principles, her sarcophagus was concealed within Temple 3, right next to the Pakal's monument. It was no accident that they were so close. It was deliberate, an unchangeable declaration. Although the Red Queen's tomb is unmarked, many academics believe she was Zakbusha's queen and trusted consort. Their funerals are strikingly identical, with both being wrapped in cinnabar, entombed in pyramids, buried with jade, and treated with the utmost devotion. Like two halves of a sacred story, these rituals reflect one another. In a cosmic vision of death and rebirth, Busa's lid famously shows him descending into the underworld tree. Such iconography is absent from the Crimson Queen's more straightforward tomb, but the combination itself is symbolic. The moon, a feminine element that pursues its own enigmatic route in the sky, would have been symbolised by the Red Queen if Pakal stood in for the sun travelling through the underworld at night before rising again. Together, they represented a cosmic duality: order and ritual, sun and moon, king and queen, and masculine and feminine. By positioning the Red Queen next to Pakal, the Maya were maintaining not only a marriage but also a cosmic partnership. In Maya mythology, rulership was not single. Rather, it was relational harmony in the universe that required balance. It's possible that their closeness and passing reflected their respective responsibilities in life. A queen standing next to her king rather than behind him, sharing not only a throne, but also a legacy. Though her name was lost to time, the Red Queen of Palanque lives on as one of the most mysterious and influential women of antiquity, not as a forgotten relic. In their tombs, they communicate without words, two souls wrapped in stone and cinnabar joined across eternity in one of history's most sacred silences. She's a mystery that still defies complete comprehension. Her tomb, which has been sealed for more than 300 years, murmurs across decades, posing questions that grow louder with each new discovery. The care taken in her burial, the abundance of her offerings, and the symbolism of her crimson-drenched bones all speak of a woman who was profoundly important, not just as a wife or consort, but as someone who held real influence, spiritual weight, and royal blood, even though we may never know exactly who she was because no glyph carved her name or a robber told her story. The Red Queen makes us rethink our presumptions today. She serves as a reminder that women were not quiet in the world of the ancient Maya. While rulers like Pakal have long dominated the spotlight, they oversaw dynasties, led ceremonies, and ruled cities. The reappearance of the Crimson Queen serves as a reminder that men were not the only ones with authority. Mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries were all conduits for it. The items she left behind are only one aspect of her legacy. It's the discussion she sparked between historians, archaeologists, storytellers, and artists. Every layer of cinnabar, every jade bead, and every architectural decision made in the temple all convey a purposeful message. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her story, not what we know, but what we still don't, is that this woman mattered. We learn from the Red Queen that history is more than simply a set of facts. A common human desire to establish a connection with the past is a living puzzle. In that way, her legacy continues to develop. Red, the colour of sacrifice, life, blood, and rebirth, is wrapped around her. Once concealed by a jade mask, her face now gazes back at us via awe, art, and science. She's still unnamed but not voiceless, enigmatic but not forgotten. In death, the Red Queen rules something more than our wildest dreams, even though she controlled a kingdom in life. Stone was used to seal her tomb. Even if her story was written in silence, she manages to communicate. On July 6, 1907, Frida Kahlo was born in the bustling Coyoacan neighborhood, which was then a small village outside of Mexico City. Casa Azul, also known as the Blue House, where she grew up, was a vibrant, contradictory and subduedly powerful place. Later on, it would serve as a battlefield, a sanctuary, and a museum dedicated to one of the most famous artists of the 20th century. Guillermo Kahlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilda Calderón, a devoted Catholic of Spanish and indigenous ancestry, had 4 daughters, Frida being the third. Her parents couldn't be more different. Guillermo is a quiet and thoughtful person. Matilda was emotionally aloof and religious. As a youngster, Frida was creative, vocal, and fearless. She would acquire her mother's ferocious tenacity, as well as her father's reflection and artistic vision. She read a lot and asked questions that most adults didn't want to hear. However, when she was 6 years old, she got polio, which made her right leg weaker and thinner than the other. She attempted to cover this physical difference with long skirts, but she never let it break her spirit. She was separated from other kids and bedridden for months due to the disease. She became close to her father during this period, who urged her to maintain her mental acuity, exercise, and ride a bicycle. Frida didn't want to be a wife or a housewife like most girls of her era did. She enrolled at the esteemed Nash with the intention of becoming a doctor. She was one of just a few females accepted to Mexico City's preparatory school at the age of 15, and she distinguished herself not only for her intelligence, but also for her rebellious wit, radical thinking, and distinct sense of style. Frida was lured to revolution and ideas that went against the grain, so she joined a group of young intellectuals known as the Caucasus, who debated politics, literature, and philosophy. However, Frida Kahlo was already putting herself into the world with sharp edges, unrepentant views, and an identity too enormous to fit under anyone else's expectations, even in those early years, before the bus crash that would define her body and the renown that would define her legacy. Her upbringing was not limited to Coyoacan. She was getting ready to completely reinvent herself. Frida Kahlo's life was divided on September 17th, 1925, into the woman she was compelled to become and the girl she had been. She was laughing, making jokes, and most likely fighting with her lover, Alejandro Gomez Arias, when they got on a wooden bus that afternoon after school. Frida never did anything half-heartedly, but a few moments later the bus and a streetcar crashed, and her future suddenly fell apart in quiet metal and anguish. The collision was horrifying. Passengers were thrown and wood was splintered as the streetcar smashed the bus against a wall. An iron handrail impaled Frida. It went through her pelvis and into her left hip. Her right leg snapped, her foot dislocated, her clavicle and ribs cracked, and her spinal column fractured in 3 places. She had a punctured abdomen and a dislocated shoulder. She was only 18. A man threw a borrowed overcoat over her. Frida was transported to the Red Cross hospital and had multiple surgeries when someone else saw that her body was sparkling. Not from blood, but from the gold powder she had been carrying in a pouch. The powder had exploded on impact, dusting her broken form in what appeared to be dazzling ash. The future she had dreamed of becoming a doctor drew farther away every day as she spent weeks in a body cast flat on her back, immobilized, writhing with infection and fear. But in that stillness, something started to move. She received brushes from her father. A unique easel was rigged by her mother to dangle over her bed. Frida started painting, initially out of boredom and later out of obsession, after a mirror was set up on the canopy so she could see herself laying there in plaster and suffering. Since she was all she had, her earliest themes were reflections of herself. But survival, not vanity, was what surfaced. In addition to breaking her physically, the crash had given her access to her own body, mind, and ultimately the strange language of identity and sorrow that would come to define her art. Now, as Frida Kahlo lay wrapped in steel and plaster, a body struggling with each breath, The girl who had aspired to heal others started healing herself, one brushstroke at a time. She started painting as a kind of therapy, but it quickly evolved into a language that was intensely personal, brutally honest, and frequently difficult to look at, all of which were exactly what she wanted. Frida did not depict courteous landscapes or lovely flowers. She depicted her own physical, emotional, and existential suffering. Not because she was conceited, but rather because, as she famously stated, "I paint myself because I am so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." Her initial subjects were self-portraits. Mexican retablos, religious paintings intended to recount tales of suffering and miracles, served as the inspiration for her early small-scale paintings on tin or wood panels. Frida introspectively transformed this custom. The canvas was her body. She portrayed herself as broken, pierced, and bleeding, turning her feelings into the altar. She is depicted as a contemporary martyr, impaled by nails in one picture. In another, she is tied to a broken column and floats in a desolate setting, symbolizing her fractured spine. She depicted herself crying, broken, beheaded and naked, but she was never passive. She was constantly aware that her suffering was not being alleviated. She used beauty, defiance, and even humour to depict the ugly side of trauma. Her body, her experience, and herself were all reclaimed in each piece. Being a woman in a society that frequently attempted to define her, Frida wasn't merely narrating her tale, though. She was creating a brand new genre of visual storytelling that combined symbolism, medical illustration, surrealism, and Mexican folk art. Her paintings, which were framed in myth, culture, and colour, turned into dreams that resembled autopsy of her soul. Frida was no longer the young woman who had aspired to become a doctor by the time she was well enough to walk once more, albeit in agony. She was an artist, and no one had ever seen her work before. The worst thing that had ever happened to her had been transformed into a source of inspiration by her. Frida Kahlo painted more than just her suffering. She transformed sorrow into a holy act of self-expression by forcing the world to look at it. The most significant and tumultuous relationship of Frida Kahlo's life began in 1928, when she was still recuperating and painting at the age of 21. Diego Rivera, who was 20 years her elder and already Mexico's most well-known painter, was enormous in both size and presence. Known for his expansive, politically charged frescoes that depicted the history of the Mexican people, Rivera was a titan of Mexican mural art. Frida had previously seen his art. She appreciated that, but now she wanted to know what he thought of her work. At the Ministry of Education, she interrupted his scaffolded work to show him her paintings and asked directly, "Do I have talent?" "Yes, and not just out of kindness," Diego answered after taking one glance. Her voice was raw and honest, full of anger, irony, anguish, and beauty, and he recognized something uncommon in her. They started a relationship that was both creative and consuming. According to Frida, I was knocked down by a trolley in one of my two mishaps in life. Diego was the other. They were an unusual couple to outsiders when they got married in 1929. Diego, big, disloyal, well-known in politics. The sharp-tongued, fiercely independent Frida is already using a cane to walk. Her parents referred to it as an elephant-dove marriage. Their bond was turbulent yet passionate. Diego encouraged her to develop as a painter and supported her artistic endeavours. But he was also incredibly unfaithful. Frida, who was heartbroken even by her own sister Christina, took lovers of her own, both male and female, including alleged liaisons with painter Georgia O'Keeffe and Leon Trotsky. They remarried a year later on different terms after divorcing in 1939. Frida would retain her independence, her house, her money, and her name this time. Their second marriage focused more on mutual understanding and artistic collaboration than it did on conventional love. Diego continued to be an important part of Frida's life, in spite of the pain and betrayals. They were not peaceful, but they were legendary. He pushed her and hurt her, but he also saw her as a revolutionary, an artist, and a woman who could reinvent what painting could be. As Diego Rivera finished well-known mural contracts in the 1930s, Frida Kahlo travelled north with him to places like San Francisco, Detroit and New York. She experienced American industrialism, affluence, and the contradictions of capitalism during her years overseas, which left her feeling deeply uneasy politically. As a fervent communist, a strong Mexican nationalist, and a supporter of indigenous customs, Frida was even more disillusioned by the luxury she saw in the US during the Great Depression, which devastated most of the nation. She made fun of the culture's consumerism and fixation on appearances in letters home. She missed Mexico's contradiction, grit, and colour. Frida started creating smaller, more intimate revolution paintings on canvas and tin, while Diego painted massive murals on industrial walls. Sharp, bizarre, dramatic, and personal became her signature style. She created some of her most famous self-portraits during this period. Frida painted herself in need to survive, not merely to boost her ego. Her landscape became her identity. She turned inward since her body hurt all the time following her accident, several operations, and a failed pregnancy in Detroit. She was depicted in her portraits as wounded, broken, and vulnerable. Despite being used, her expression remained composed, straightforward, and unrepentant. In Henry Ford Hospital, one of her most potent pieces, she is depicted sobbing while laying on a hospital bed amid floating representations of loss, including a fetus, a snail, medical equipment, and a fractured pelvis. It was an unvarnished, vivid, and intensely emotional canvas that was dripping with reality. Frida became deeply involved in socialist politics after returning to Mexico. During Leon Trotsky's exile, she and Diego took him into their home. Frida donned traditional indigenous clothing, such as Tijuana dresses, not just as fashion, but also as a political and cultural statement. Her art was always related to her beliefs. Her identity, body, and ideology were all woven into her creations. Frida became a painter of resistance as well as suffering as she painted the human cost of revolution, while Rivera was painting murals of it. She depicted the body in parts, the mind on fire, and the self constantly looking back in exile and illness. Frida Kahlo was more than simply Diego Rivera's wife when she returned to Mexico in the late 1930s. She had transformed into a force and an artist whose work exuded cultural identity, strange symbolism, and unvarnished honesty. When she returned home, she totally embraced who she was. In Coyoacán, her Casa Azul turned into a haven of paradox and colour. Aztec idols in the garden, bright cobalt walls, yellow trim, and free-ranging parrots and monkeys. Frida's creativity came to life in the house. It was a fusion of earth and elegance, tradition and rebellion. She surrounded herself with revolutionary texts, folk art, ex-votos, and pre-Columbian items here. Amidst the sounds of mariachi music on the street outside and the aroma of copal incense, she painted, donned bold Tijuana gowns, and woven flowers into her hair. There was a creative explosion during this time. Her paintings were increasingly complex, political and symbolic. A split self was depicted in pieces like as the two Fridas, one dressed in European garb with a bleeding heart, and the other in native garb, both of them calm and strong. It was Frida's graphic autobiography, a portrayal of heritage, love, and grief. Artists such as Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky hailed her passionately distinctive approach when she displayed her work in Paris in 1939. Frida, however, stood apart even among the surrealists, and when André Breton attempted to claim her as one of their own, she resisted. She claimed that they believed me to be a surrealist, but I wasn't. I didn't paint dreams. My reality was painted by me. She depicted Mexico as a live, breathing nation rather than the idyllic postcard image. She loved. Skeletons, hummingbirds, hearts, thorns, maize, blood, and symbolism were all prevalent in her artwork. She exposed the violence of her country's past and today while respecting its indigenous roots. However, her health was deteriorating even as her creative voice became more powerful. Chronic pain, infections, and numerous procedures became commonplace. Despite this, Frida painted through it while propped up in bed, her torso tied in corsets, her fingers clasped around the brush. Frida had come to Mexico not to rest, but to regain her power via politics, painting, and her unafraid self-acceptance. Frida Kahlo's body continued to betray her as the 1940s went on. She has a deteriorating spine. Her right leg was diseased all the time, Throughout her life, she had over 30 surgeries, frequently in quick succession. She occasionally spent months in bed, immobilised by traction devices that stretched her bones apart or covered in body casts. Even nevertheless, every canvas she created throughout these years served as a form of resistance as well as relief. Her art became more rebellious and darker. She refused to hide behind metaphor and painted with a clarity honed by suffering. She appears divided in the centre in the shattered column, her body perforated with nails, her spine replaced by a cracked ionic column, yet her face remains stern and her eyes steadfast. For Frida, pain was more than a topic. Her political voice also became louder, and it was her muse, her adversary and her partner, for. When her health prevented her from walking, she joined the Mexican Communist Party, participated in protests, wrote vehement letters, and denounced injustice and imperialism. She defiantly held signs and yelled slogans while attending protests in a wheelchair. Frida's health was so precarious that physicians advised her she couldn't attend her first solo exhibition in Mexico in 1953, which was a long overdue celebration of her art. Thus, she took the only action that Frida would. Dressed in traditional finery and surrounded by her own artwork, she arrived by ambulance, was carried in on a stretcher, and was placed on her hospital bed in the centre of the gallery. She greeted everyone with exuberant laughter, and that fire still burning in her eyes. Her last works were both horrific and innocent. The sick will get better under Marxism. She removed symbols of tyranny by painting herself in a steel corset held in Marx's hands. One of her final known pieces was a still life with cut watermelons with the words "Viva la vida" written on it. She had a long life, remaining joyous, political, and defiant despite death. Not all of Frida Kahlo's final portraits were self-portraits. They were revolutionary deeds, shown in agony but invariably marked with vitality. In her birthplace, La Casa Azul in Coyoacán, Frida Kahlo passed away on July 13, 1954 at the age of 47. Although a pulmonary embolism was reported as the official cause, her closest friends and family suspected something more serious. Yes, she had been sick, but she had also been worn out by the pain, the surgeries, and the protracted battle with her own body. She was weak and in a wheelchair, yet she persisted on attending to a political demonstration against the CIA-led coup in Guatemala a few days prior. Revolution persisted as she raised her clenched fist in the air. Her final journal entry, her last heartbeat, was succinct yet sharp. "I hope it's a happy departure, and I hope I never come back." The Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most esteemed cultural centre, hosted Frida's funeral. Friends, family, artists and revolutionaries guarded her body, which was draped in the Mexican Communist Party's red flag. Diego Rivera was distraught. Even though his betrayals had almost destroyed her, he referred to her as the greatest love of his life, and in the years after her passing, something remarkable occurred. Frida Kahlo resisted going missing. Her name was initially solely mentioned in art circles. It was difficult to classify her paintings since they were too fantastical for traditionalists and too political for surrealists. However, as feminist scholars and activists regained lost voices, Frida's image, story, and defiance gradually gained traction throughout the 1970s and 1980s. She was no longer merely a painter. She represented the transformation of suffering into beauty, the emergence of feminism via resistance, the unapologetic celebration of Mexican identity, queerness, disability, revolution, and authenticity. Her face, flowers in her hair, and unibrow look became famous. Her journal was turned into a holy book, her house was turned into a museum, and her paintings are now displayed in the best museums in the world. Despite spending a large portion of her life in Diego's shadow, Frida Kahlo took a stand in death. She left behind more than simply artwork. She left a mirror behind and challenged us all to gaze at it with fire rather than fear or sympathy. Frida Kahlo's visage is now well recognised thanks to her trademark unibrow, flower-crowned hair, direct look, and murals that have been transformed into dolls, t-shirts, memes, posters, and icons. Not only do people remember her face, but they also understand the reality behind it, which is what gives her legacy its strength. Frida didn't strive for perfection. She was not a box fitter. She didn't want to live in a society that expected perfection and wasn't traditional. Realness, raw, Dirty, lively, angry, joyous, contradictory was what she gave us. She created art that crossed boundaries and decades by embracing her uniqueness, including her disability, queerness, politics and culture. She is no longer only an artist, she is a world traveller, emblem of artistic resistance, cultural pride and defiant feminism. She's regarded by gay communities as a courageous bisexual figure who lived freely and fearlessly during a period when silence was required. She is proof that suffering can fire the brush rather than stop it, and she serves as a reminder to women that disabled artists can have power without permission. She's also a feisty folklore daughter who has been reclaimed by Mexico and will always be a part of the country's spirit. Her paintings are now among the most admired in the world, having earlier been written down as being too odd or intimate. Anybody who has ever suffered and needed to transform that anguish into something sacred will relate to works like The Broken Column, The Two Fridas, and the self-portrait with the thorn necklace and hummingbird. A communist who wore gold, a lady who had been betrayed but had fallen in love again, a body in pieces with an indomitable soul. She lived on the periphery and elevated them to the forefront. She painted with conviction throughout it all, not just with colour. Being a symbol was not what Frida Kahlo requested. She just spoke the truth about herself, and by doing so she spoke to millions of people who had never previously seen their reflections in art. When we look at her face now, we see colour and courage. Resistance is evident. We regard Frida as immortal rather than dead,